Hello, thanks for tuning in to our panel on current research on fakes, misinformation, and fact-checking. My name is Bente Kalsnes, and I'm an associate professor at Christiania University College in Oslo, Norway, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel today. I'm part of the research project SCAM, Source Criticism and Mediating Disinformation, and we are cooperating with the Global Fact 7 on this academic track. The SCAM project will identify the main challenges related to the ways in which technology and platforms affect the distribution of disinformation in public spheres and ways to detect and counter it. And we have a call for paper in digital journalism right now with the title Fighting Fakes, News Publisher, Fact Checkers, Platforms, Companies and Policymaking. Check it out if you are working on related topics. In this session, we will hear from 5 exciting researchers, and I will introduce them one by one. And all their video of their presentations are available on the Global Facts websites, and maybe some of you have seen them already. In this session, we'll talk more about their work and findings. And in the first part of the session, we will hear from 3 researchers. And then we'll have a change of scene and we will get 2 new researchers in. The researchers are based in the UK, US, Namibia, and Estonia. So we are dealing with a whole set of different time zones. And they will talk about issues such as the role of fact checkers, quizzes, efforts to monitor health misinformation, and journalist skills. During the session, feel free to post comments and questions in on the hashtag, and I will try to integrate them in our talk at the end of each session. And first, I would like to welcome Jessica Koller, who is a research fellow at the University of Texas at Austin, who will talk a bit about her research project, Testing Knowledge to Battle Misinformation, how quizzes can improve people's memory of fact checks. So Jessica, could you please tell me a bit about yourself and your research?
Sure, thank you. It's wonderful to be here in this virtual setting. I'm Jessica Collier. As Bente said, I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Texas at Austin and a research associate with the Center for Media Engagement there. I'd like to give a quick shout out to my co-authors on this project, Lisa Fazio and Ranak Pillai, who are with the Building Knowledge Lab at Vanderbilt University. My work at the center has been tackling issues related to how to improve the likelihood that people engage with fact checks, particularly those on social media, how we can make sure that they walk away with accurate beliefs and knowledge related to false content. And our project today deals specifically with quizzes. So I'm sure all of you have encountered a news article at some point that has a multiple choice quiz embedded somewhere in the article. And our project for Global Fact was looking at how we can use quizzes as a means of increasing engagement with fact checks, as well as using them as a mechanism to help readers improve their memory of the content of the fact check, even a week after reading it. So I won't go into too much detail about the specifics of the project right now, but just to say that we find this really interesting and somewhat confusing story where quizzes help people remember answers to these really complex health-related questions, even a week after reading a fact check, but they seem to be ineffective at improving people's ability to accurately identify a false claim as indeed false. Our research is going to disentangle this moving forward, and I look forward to chatting more and taking your questions in just a bit.
Thank you, Jessica. I really enjoyed learning more about your research. Now, I would like to introduce Scott Hale, who is the Director of Research and Senior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. And he's going to talk about their research project, Monitoring Health Misinformation, an early detection methodology for fact checkers. So, Scott, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Of course. Thank you, Bente. So I'm Director of Research at Medan, a nonprofit that builds technology for global journalism, and senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, University of Oxford. And I guess this research project, in a way, spanned that sort of practice to industry, practice to academic sort of spectrum. Was working with excellent co-authors from the Harvard School of Public Health, Jenna Sherman, Midan's program director for the Digital Health Lab, Nat Gines, and Ashkan Kazumi at the University of Michigan in computer science. And this was all done in 2019. We had no idea that health would be such a hot topic as we stand here today. But even without the pandemic, there are thousands of health conversations that are happening every day online. And so this work was very much an idea to think about how could we give a bird's eye view to health practitioners, to journalists, fact checkers, to be able to sort of keep a finger on the pulse of the conversation that is happening online and to identify meaningful shifts that occur. We had the hypothesis that some of those shifts would correspond to misinformation, and indeed some do. I would say many don't, in fact, in what we've found, but they're nonetheless, I think, useful in order to engage and understand what people are discussing online, to make note of, oh, there's this big event that's happening, or there's this other development, and all of a sudden people are talking about a health word in a new context, in a new way. And that's what we pursued in this paper by developing natural language processing methods and extending semantic change. So look forward to the questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And now we are turning over to Admire Mare from the Namibia University of Science and Technology, who is a senior lecturer, who's going to talk about his research project, Verifiers of Last Resort, Information Disorder and Fact-Checking Organizations in Africa. So, Admire, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research, please?
Thank you so much, Bente, for having me here. Basically, my name is Admire Mare. I'm a senior lecturer at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. This particular project that I'm presenting here is just an offshoot of a project that I'm already working on social media, misinformation, and elections in Kenya and in Zimbabwe. So essentially, the crux of the matter in terms of this particular research is to understand the role that fact-checking organizations are playing within the fact-checking ecosystem. So essentially, in many ways, this particular research tries to look at what is the role of fact-checking organizations in terms of actually fact-checking fake news related to politics, for example, not really related to health, health information, for example, like the pandemic right now that we're dealing with, which is the coronavirus. So essentially, it builds on again, a database in terms of actually doing interviews with journalists that are within this ecosystem of fact-checking organizations. Here, I'm talking about Namibia Fact Checker. I'm also talking about Africa Check, and also talking about Zimbabwe Fact, which is also another fact-checking organization that is based in Zimbabwe. So basically, this particular research tries to problematize in terms of all these internal and external publics within these fact-checking organizations to say what exactly has been happening, to what extent have these fact-checking organizations been effective in terms of stemming the spread and also the production of viral claims that have swept through the social media platforms, especially in the African context. And again, the other issue that it tries to problematize is also tries to problematize the bias that has been there in terms of fact-checking organizations, where they focus more on viral claims and also ignore those that they consider to be not viral claims. So at the end of the day, what you tend to see being debunked are viral claims, but other claims that also have got very serious societal impact and also challenge are being ignored, and that also raises serious problems going forward in terms of the role that fact checking can actually play in this kind of environment where we find so many disinformation actually being spread right now, especially in relation to coronavirus. But again, the other issue that it also problematizes the issue around of fact checking organizations pretty much coming in late as post moderation kind of, fact checkers, rather than focusing on pre-production. And again, there I actually argued that there is need for a collaboration between, for example, newsrooms and fact-checking organizations, so that even at the level of production of some of the news, the fact-checking organizations can actually be involved in that process, so that again, we can be able to stem the tide that we have seen. And again, here I'm talking about in a context where in Africa we are dealing with information poverty, but we are also dealing with information overload, especially on social media platforms. And this creates a serious situation in terms of actually creating even a misinformed citizenry, but also even a disinformed citizenry, if I have to use that particular word. So I look forward to questions in relation to this particular study that is still ongoing. As I have said, it's an offshoot from a project that I'm already working on.
Thank you, everyone. So now we brought all together, and we're going to have a discussion before we open up for questions from the audience. So I would like to continue a little bit on what you said, Admira. You talked about how to select what type of information to check. And sometimes the fact-checking organization mainly focusing on viral stories, while neglecting other but equally important stories. What kind of criteria do you think are important when selecting what to fact-check?
For me, I think the most important thing is what is in the public interest. As long as, again, we need to go back to the crux of journalism, which is about focusing on public interest information. So whatever is in the public information for me, in the public interest for me, deserves to actually to be fact checked. So at the end of the day, I think we run the risk of actually promoting, this bias, this viral information bias that is already embedded in most fact-checking organizations. And this actually, for me, raises a serious problem, because what about those issues that don't have that same traction, but at the same time we have equally devastating consequences for society? What are we going to do with those kinds of claims that we are not paying attention to?
Thank you, Admira. Jessica, I would like to hear a little bit more from your project. I'm also curious, what do you think about using quizzes as part of fact-checking or remembering fact-check information? What started your approach?
Sure. So at the Center for Media Engagement, a few years ago, we developed a quiz creator tool that is just an embeddable iframe that we made available to newsrooms who would be interested in using the quiz tool to, place within their articles. And it's been adopted by over 150 newsrooms at this point. And our research has shown that when you include a quiz, people actually spend more time engaging with the article, and they remember more from the news article. So really upping the information quality that people are getting there. And we were like, why couldn't this work with fact checks? And there's research that my co-authors in psychology have pointed to about how multiple choice quizzes are actually really good for memory as well. So it was sort of this meeting of the two worlds, where we want people to engage more with fact checks, and we also want them to remember things. So it just seemed like a natural bridge to test out whether this would actually be the case.
And are you surprised by the findings? For example, you said that you didn't see an effect when it comes to identifying false claims. Was that surprising for you, or?
It was. It was definitely not what we had hypothesized. And we have we're following up on this, first of all, and we think that maybe the quiz questions have to be more closely related to the false claim itself. So rather than asking really specific, in-depth questions about the information in the fact check, asking them more questions that are directly related to whether the claim is false or not might help with that. And then the second thing is these were health-related topics, and so we don't know if maybe we explore different fact checks, if we would find different findings there. So the research has a lot of different directions to go in. I think the most important thing that we found was that when you ask them these really complex questions like, what is the blood-brain barrier? And you ask them to just write out a response to that. Even a week later, people are still getting at least 40% of those questions correct if they've received a quiz, which I find impressive.
Yeah. Any comments to Jessica from the rest of the panel?
I was curious, Jessica, to learn a little bit more about the control condition. I guess trying to think what's, the opposite of, okay, you've had someone do a quiz, and that's probably primed them to look at certain parts of the article or the certain things that are included there. And I wonder, whether it's that interaction, whether you can have a stronger control condition in terms of maybe putting those statements in bold in the control, or is there some other activity that isn't a quiz that gives us a tougher comparison, I guess.
Sure, that's a good point. We have the control condition that receives no quiz, and we have the before condition that receives the quiz prior to reading the article at all, which I think is where we would see that sort of priming effect of, oh, I need to pay more attention because I'll probably get more questions about this later. But I don't really know how. I think the getting the questions after it, they might just say like I would expect them to attend to the article the same amount as they would if they just didn't receive a quiz at all. But that's a good point and something we should consider moving forward.
Thanks. And Scott, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about how words can change meaning and how you can detect that. What kind of developments are you looking for?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, and there's obviously more detail in the presentation. But in natural language processing, traditionally, what has been done recently is people have looked at large volumes of text over many years. So maybe the whole century, the 1900s of American English or something, and then trained models to understand what a word meant based on the context it appeared in. And as a word would change its context, then we would see that sort of representation of the word drifting in a mathematical space. And our question was whether we could basically speed that up. Obviously, we don't want to wait years. We don't want to wait a century to see what's changed. But also, we're not necessarily interested in lasting changes. So yes, the word gay is now used completely differently today from how it was in the 1900s, and that's a lasting change. But actually, we're really also interested in these sort of ephemeral changes where maybe it's changed this month and then back to another use the next month. And so those were the types of methods we were looking at deploying over a really large social media data set, Twitter to begin with, covering 5.5 years of tweets. But in fact, these methods could be applied to any large text data in any language, in fact.
Could you give an example of a health-related word that has changed meaning and how you could detect that?
Yeah, so we looked both at individual words and we looked at pairs of words as well. And as I said, many of these were sort of larger events or things that happened in the news cycle. Let me maybe take flu and hid was a pair where we noted there was a month that it talked about extremely differently, and these two were much more associated with each other than they had in all the surrounding months. And if you dig into it at the end, there was basically a plane crash where a pilot was ill, maybe had symptoms of the flu, and hid this from his employer. And so that's the sort of large-scale thing where we could see all of a sudden, okay, there's real interest in this word, not just volume, but all of a sudden, okay, it's being brought into the neighborhood of another word in our vocabulary. I think in that instance, there actually wasn't any particular misinformation around it, but in other cases, flu and remedy, for instance, there was clear misinformation in that discussion.
Admira or Jessica, any comments for Scott?
Yeah, in looking at these, word changes, are you able to look at whether opinion leaders or like journalists or elites are the ones sort of driving that versus the public is generating these sort of associations on their own?
It's a great question. We didn't look at that. I think, next steps, always more to do. These were reflective of, where the broader conversation was going based on a random sample of all of Twitter in English in this case.
Admira, do you have any comments?
Not at the moment. You can proceed. I'll say something when I have the question.
Okay, good. I'll ask you a question, Admira, because in your presentation you also talked about some of the problems when it comes to limited resources, both when it comes to technology, money, skills, and I was wondering if you have any ideas of how this can be improved when it comes to the spread of misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was trying to raise in that particular paper was to say that, if you look at the spread and also even the production of, these information disorders, whether we call them misinformation or disinformation, is that especially in the African context, you have to see it within the context again of digital, illiteracy, some kind of illiteracy that is actually also fueling it. So people somehow, circulate it with unknowingly that they are actually doing it, or even they actually forward it unknowingly before they know that actually they are doing that kind of thing. So that raises also very serious issues in terms of what kind of digital literacy initiatives are required to be able to deal with that, especially in African context. And I've seen that, some fact-checking organizations, for example, ZimFact and also Africa Check, especially in Nigeria, they have started having campaigns around digital literacy initiatives, especially in schools and also in universities, so that they can also help students to actually know how to fact-check stories before they can actually circulate within their own WhatsApp groups or even social media platforms. So I think that's the way to go. I think that would certainly help. But I think we need something more than that, because only fact-checking at the level of fact-checking organizations alone, probably the problem that I've also seen, especially in the African context, that yes, they could, a news story can be debunked or even a claim can be debunked, but it will not travel, and also it will not go viral. The fact-checked news would actually not, be as viral as the initial story, and that also creates a lot of problems, because at the end of the day, people who don't get the debunked information will still hold on to that initial story that they had in the first place, and that is the problem that we are seeing, especially in the African context.
Thanks.
I'm interested.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Admira as well. Sorry to jump in. Yeah, but just in terms of the role of fact checkers within traditional media organizations as well. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that some of the first fact checking work was actually teams within the traditional media, and I'm wondering the extent to which you're seeing that happen in the context you studied.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Actually, the other issue that I also raised in this particular paper is that, unfortunately, because of the resource limitations that the newsrooms have in the African context, these kinds of initiatives have not really been able to withstand the financial pressures that the newsrooms are going through. So you have seen more and more companies actually retrenching sub-editors, even editors. So you probably have just one editor who's going to be in charge of almost everything. So at the end of the day, the gatekeeping role that was there, in the olden days is no longer there. So obviously, certain stories are just escaping these gates that are unmanned somehow, so to speak. So that also creates a problem. So that's why I think we are seeing more and more external fact-checking organizations, coming into existence outside of the newsroom, because they've seen that there is a gap already within the newsroom, because they cannot cope with the pressures, and also they also don't have the budgets to pay for sub-editors and also editors.
Yeah, it's resource demanding to do fact checks. Actually, we have a question from the audience. It's kind of a philosophical question, so you have to listen in. How how are individuals processing information? Is their first thought a critical approach to information, or do they depend on their own experiences when absorbing information? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take this. I think it depends on their motivations for seeking out information. So depending on the space that they find themselves in, if they're just scrolling on social media, I think probably no, they're not critically approaching that information at all. And then secondly, I think related to do their own pre-existing sort of beliefs affect that? I think yes. I think especially if they're processing political information or something where they probably have a strongly held opinion already, then maybe they are critical of it, but with that sort of political lens to things. But I'll let someone else take this.
Thanks. Anyone else?
I think your research, Jessica, probably speaks most to that.
Okay, here's another one from the hashtag. Thinking about a fact-checking quiz, would you be comfortable showing misleading content to measure whether people are capable of detecting what is true? I guess that is for Jessica.
That is a great ethical question.
Yeah.
I will say in the quizzes that we used, we only asked about sort of the factual true content that was in the fact check itself, not, it wasn't sort of like quizzing people on whether it was true or false, but I have seen those in a lot of, popular news outlets. They'll say, like, can you identify whether these headlines are true or false? And I think giving that disclaimer ahead of time maybe makes that okay, because then people are actually interested in what's true or false afterwards. But yes, I would stick toward asking the more factual claims within the articles.
I see. Anyone else? Do you have any thoughts about the ethical aspect of this? No?
I think you've nailed it, Jessica. Yeah, and it's probably around keeping people informed and understanding what they're being tested on.
Yeah. Do you have any comments at the end? We have time. We have a few more minutes before we end this segment. Any closing thoughts?
Looks like we maybe got one more question.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think we would see a difference training the NLP on social media versus formal speech, like a politician?
I guess that may be directed at me, and yeah, I think a real challenge with social media data is that it's not well structured. There's often grammatical errors, etc. So I think there are things that can be done with greater confidence.
NLP is natural language process.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think when we think about natural language processing, there's often more that could be done in formal speeches, and it might be able to better distinguish different contexts for words, etc., in a way that sometimes can be challenging given the informal nature of social media.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed watching your presentations, and they're going to be, you're able to find them on the Global Facts website. And now we're going to bring in the last segment of this panel. And first, I would like to welcome Thomas Kent, adjunct associate professor at Columbia University, who's going to talk about his research project, The Authoritarian Information Threat. Does fact-checking need to adapt? So, Tom, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your research, please?
Sure. Hi, Bente. I teach at Columbia University about disinformation, journalism, and journalism ethics. I had a long career in journalism with the Associated Press, much of it as a foreign correspondent, and then as standards editor responsible for the truth and the balance of AP content. And I've also been president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is based in Prague, and that's a U.S. congressional funded news service operating in 25 languages to the countries of the former Soviet Union, the Balkans, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. There's no question, certainly, that international fact-checking has been highly successful in many ways. But what I've been looking at is, to me, a significant gap in fact-checking work. Fact-checking lacks focus on one of the most pernicious threats to the world's information bloodstream, and that is false content intentionally created by authoritarian states. This disinformation is professionally distributed at industrial scale by governments that have almost no accountability to their own people or to the world. Fact-checking grew up as a country-by-country pursuit. Local media and civil society groups organized to judge statements by powerful people in their own nations. And ideally, fact-checking should be local. But local fact-checkers can work only in countries with some degree of political freedom. In authoritarian countries, accusing highly placed people of lying is not a healthy pursuit. In such conditions, important countries are left entirely without reliable fact-checking organizations, and that leads to distortion of the worldwide fact-checking picture. In 2019, for example, the International Fact-Checking Network organized a project at the UN General Assembly. Members of the IFCN collaborated to monitor their national leaders' speeches at the General Assembly. The speeches by the rulers of some of the world's more repressive countries went unchecked because there was no IFCN member based in those countries to do the checking. There were plenty of fact checkers, of course, for the leaders of democratic countries. And I think the overall tapestry created by the IFCN project could perhaps give the impression that lying politicians are a feature primarily of democratic states. So I pose the question, how might we mitigate this problem? And one approach would be to create more offshore teams working outside the borders of repressive countries. These would subject these nations' leaders to the same kind of accountability as leaders of democratic states. Now, some of these teams exist already. There are a couple organizations based in Toronto that fact-check the Iranian government. And the IFCN could select a small number of countries as initial candidates for new offshore teams. And these teams would have a couple goals. One would be to alert the world to major false stories coming out of these countries. Sometimes these false stories get checked when they come into the information bloodstream of individual other countries, but rarely are they tracked back to their original source. And these teams could also serve the country's internal populations with fact-checking on smaller, more local issues. So I think that well-designed and managed offshore groups could benefit not only the countries they focus on, but the international fact-checking movement as a whole. They would warn the world about false narratives coming out of these countries and also help counter disinformation inside them. And they would give audiences confidence that the world's fact-checking community is committed to exposing deception by all countries. I'll stop here, but my thinking does include, of course, some downsides to this idea, some problems we're likely to see with offshore fact-checking, but we can talk about that additionally if you like.
Thank you, Tom. And now I would like to introduce Mariu Himakadakas, a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And she will talk about her project, Sparing Time from Fact-Checking, Journalist Skills and Competences in Recognizing and Publishing False Information. So could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your research, Mariu?
Hi, Bente, and hi, Global Fact. I'm Mariu Himakadakas. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Karlstad University in Sweden and also part-time research fellow at the University of Tartu, Estonia. My research is mainly in journalism studies. I'm specializing on journalistic skills. The study I presented here in Global Fact, I conducted with my colleague Ingrid Goyamets at the University of Tartu. And the study tests the journalist's abilities to recognize different forms of false information in everyday work situations. And to highlight some findings of the study, firstly, the information that looks trustworthy passes the journalistic filter more easily, since it enables to spare time, for example, from fact-checking. Secondly, journalists still rely on the expertise, honesty, and factuality of the source. For example, if it's a governmental office that publishes some piece of newsworthy information on social media, it must be true, and therefore needs no further fact-checking by the journalist. This is some examples that we had from our interviews with journalists. However, journalists tend not to use the skills to evaluate fake social media accounts and the manipulation of photos and videos, for example. And maybe thirdly, to highlight, there are no special skills that differ from usual journalistic fact-checking skills, but journalists, especially older and not, so to say, native social media journalists, tend not to recognize manipulated information. And therefore, the information passes the fact-check filter easily. We conducted the study in Estonian newsrooms on different platforms, but we plan to extend this to Sweden as well. And we have some ideas how to support newsrooms and journalists in fact-checking and in collaboration with fact-checking organizations. But we can discuss this further on this panel.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, so we'll go into the conversation, and I think I'll continue where you ended, Mario, because you had some really interesting findings in your project. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about what is the reason for the low skills in visual verification among journalists? Why do they have problems detecting manipulated or false images?
Well, it is hard to say what is exactly behind that, but one reason could be that it is quite new when we talk about, for example, deep fakes or manipulated visual information, for example, fake social media accounts that resemble very well to, for example, some official account on social media. It is hard to track, but yes, I think on one side it is the matter of journalistic training. That sort of verification of information may not have been part of their training, but also that it is not very well accepted in newsrooms, not yet at least. And also one thing that we noticed is that while dealing with data stories or data information in that sense, in a wider sense, journalists do lack skills in data literacy and analyzing data, scraping data, or having that sort of idea. Also, if well, this reaches beyond already from just evaluating the factualness of visual information, but also data literacy in the sense of knowing what's true or what's not on data visualizations is an issue. So we need to work on that more. I think these are just some things that have entered the journalistic field recently and have not been part of the training, just some of the ideas.
Yeah, I think your findings also reflect back on journalism education. I think there might be some need for adjustments when it comes to the training. Tom, do you have any comments for Mario?
Yes, I think it's a really, really interesting and very depressing study, but I'm glad it was done. I have a couple questions. Did I understand correctly you to say that the older journalists seem to be more vulnerable than the younger? Well, that's a little different, counterintuitive from what you often hear, because you often hear in the world of disinformation that it's the older people who tend to sometimes be wiser, but but here there's no sense of that. And I wanted to ask you something else. You said that the journalists tended to believe official sources, is that? But are these journalists, and you'll have to tell me more about the ones you talked to, are these journalists that you studied people working within news media that are generally close to, shall we say, the power structure of the country, that might be more inclined to believe official sources? I mean, suppose you had a population, a more marginalized population, a newspaper or a website that represented a population that feels a little aggrieved or doesn't necessarily think the government is always on their side. And there are such populations in Estonia and also in most other countries. Do you think that the reaction might be any different? Did you control for that? Who were the journalists that you talked to?
Thank you for these questions. I will start from the last one. We had covered three main media houses. You must know that the Estonian population is 1.3 million only, so it's a very small media market. We have three bigger media houses, and they all have converged platforms of television, radio, newspaper, and online. And we covered all those. Those are, so to say, mainstream news media organizations, which means that Estonian media landscape is not declined towards the power, so to say. Yes, there are certain alternative media organizations as well, but they were not included. So yes, this is the shortcoming of this study. It might be, but the audience of those small alternative media houses or not media houses, or just to say alternative media organizations are truly marginalized. So I wouldn't say they would influence the overall outcome. So the trust towards the governmental institutions or institutions in a wider sense may be the result of overall trust. For example, in Estonia, not just journalists, but the overall population tends to have very high trust in institutions, in government, in the police, also in the medical system, and so on, in the education. So it may be a result of that. Also, very high trust for example, the global Wellcome Trust Monitor showed that 80% of Estonians trust science and scientists as such. So high trust in different institutions may be behind that, and also that Estonian governmental offices and other such sort of institutions tend to have a lot of communication on social media and on media in a wider sense. But regarding your other question, the question about let's say, call it experience, not age of journalists, but these may come hand in hand. Most those experienced journalists that we had in our study, they may rely or be too confident in their competence of fact-checking, and they tended to rely on their gut feeling, which was a bit alarming, because this gut feeling also told to put their trust in governmental offices and on spokespersons, for example, who, well, he or she has always had accurate information. I should trust that. So putting their trust on their previous experience was one thing, and another thing was the lack of experience of multiple or diverse ways of false information that journalists can become exposed to on social media or on other media forums. So being more critical comes hand in hand with the experience of using different sorts of media and social media in that sense as well.
You know, it seemed to me when I talk to journalists about fact-checking and the importance of getting things right, they often say, if we just had more time, that we're under so much pressure, we don't, have time to deal with anything. So I thought it was very interesting the way you structured your study. most of the things, or many of the things that you tested, many of the false things, suspicious things you put in, did not require research to determine were untrue. I mean, the plane in the field, in the field without snow in the winter, the plane that seemed too small to hold 30 people, the graph, the numbers didn't add up. I mean, this did not require hours of research to determine if it was true or false. I mean, obviously, if you want to check the origin of a photo, that requires, some time on the web to verify and so forth. But a lot of these things like numbers that don't add up in a graph, it scared me additionally. I mean, your whole study was terrifying, but it scared me additionally because these were not hard problems. These just required being sort of mentally on guard rather than requiring deep research. That just a cry from my soul.
Do you have any reply, Margie?
Yes, this study was done before COVID-19 hit us. We could have had also other examples that we had during the crisis. For example, some piece of information that was dispersed on social media by someone who was official in or close to presidential office, I guess. And the information was that Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, will be locked down. And this was published online and fact-checked later. And, well, this turned out not to be true. So there are some, that sort of examples how false information gets published. It is not often, but it happens. And it happens in critical situations. So it is alarming, and it should be. Yeah, this is what we have to deal with. Maybe it is something special to Estonia. And also what you mentioned about time pressure. It is an issue, and it is not just an issue of Estonian, for example, online newsroom especially, but also elsewhere. But the tendency tends to be in the Eastern European countries, small media markets, small language environments also in the media, few resources and so on. This all sums together in the time pressure of publishing fast, and also checking facts later. So that's an issue.
Thanks. And I have a question for Tom, and we also have some additional questions from the audience. Tom, your research was really interesting in the sense that you're trying to close a gap that you've identified when it comes to what kind of information is fact-checked, and you're particularly focusing on authoritarian countries. And you're suggesting using offshore fact-checking teams. I'm just wondering, how could these teams be structured and financed? Because often they're financed within one media, or they're organized and financed within one media market. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure, and I'll try to calm down emotionally after Mariu's terrifying report. So I think that from a finance standpoint, you think of the usual suspects. You think of the social networks or the foundations and so forth. Facebook fact check comes to mind, of course. Facebook has been a huge contributor to this. And one problem that you would face, I imagine, with Facebook is that Facebook is, not enthusiastic about being on the outs with any particular government. So, there might be outrage with Facebook supporting an offshore organization. But in that case, I think the IFCN could probably play a very helpful role. Facebook often does sort of outsource any kind of ethical, moral decisions. That's why they support IFCN instead of just having their own fact checkers. So I think it's possible that Facebook or another foundation might give a grant to IFCN, and then IFCN would itself make the decision on which countries required offshore fact-checking teams.
Great. And then we have two more questions about the same topic. What do you think are the drawbacks on having offshore organizations? And then second one, Do you think citizens in authoritarian countries would believe fact checks published by offshore fact checkers?
I'm sorry. Will they trust fact checks published by offshore fact checkers?
Believe in fact checks.
Yeah. Well, there are a bunch of drawbacks. Certainly, an offshore team could be located far from the country in question, so there's a time zone problem. It's hard for remote teams to know what is most important at any time for for the people back home, what government statements are getting the most attention, what needs most to be fact-checked. It also may be hard to get the findings back into the country because governments are getting better and better at blocking websites and interfering with social networks and so forth. So you have a problem of getting the information back in. So maybe offshore groups could partner with international broadcasters or internet freedom groups that could help pierce these internet blockades. And then third, there may be a built-in suspicion of the motives of offshore groups, not only on the part of the government, which will say these are all government enemies and angry exiles and so forth, but even some suspicion, of course, on the part of people inside the country who may entertain the same thought. So the answer to that problem is that the fact-checking just has to be so good that people will convince themselves that the fact-checkers really know what they're talking about, which probably means that the fact-checkers need to have their own contacts inside the country. So if the government says, there's plenty of meat, and the fact-checkers say, no, there isn't plenty of meat, people will be able to go to the market and see, the fact-checkers version is actually the right one.
And I also guess in order to create the trust, you need some level of transparency in order to understand how they've come up with a conclusion. And just to follow up that, we got another question to Tom. Any ideas on how to get the information needed to fact check from outside countries with little access to information?
Right. Well, that brings us back to the question of having your own people inside the country, but that doesn't mean necessarily secret agents. It just means having a wide variety of friends, family, and a network outside the country that has its own friends and family connection. Most things come out eventually. It's very hard in today's interconnected world to bottle up information. It always comes out. Now, sometimes fact checkers will have to be a little patient. They would say, we'd like to fact check this today, and we're sure the government's lying. But, if you wait a day or two, then you'll know the government's lying, or you'll know that the government might actually be telling the truth. And that would be an important thing for credibility as well. And the fact checker's product should sometimes say, yes, the government is absolutely right. Because if you just become, a service that denounces the government every day, then it really does threaten your credibility.
So, Mario, do you have any comments to Tom?
Yeah, Tom, since you're also familiar with Estonia and many other small post-Soviet countries and the environment here, first of all, while creating that sort of offshore networks for small media environments, also the Scandinavian countries as well, small language and the language barrier comes in, how to solve that problem. And the second question would be how to avoid biases or advocating in that context, which means that even if there are offshore networks helping with the fact check, how can we prevent that sort of organizations becoming advocates of someone, opaque advocates maybe, or having their biases or interests in fact checking as well? So any ideas on that?
Sure. Well, first, with regard to languages, you have, these are very small language groups, but you still have people of all sorts of points of view. And in the sense of most East European countries, in most of those, you can have fact-checking people within the country. I mean, it might be getting more difficult with regard to a couple that you could imagine, but generally speaking, I don't think you'll have to rush offshore with regard to most Eastern European countries, the way things stand at the moment. But in terms of the people who do work offshore, I think you're absolutely right. There is going to be a question of, have these groups, certainly the government will claim that these groups have been captured by anti-government activists, and indeed some of them may be, journalists or political figures who escaped with their lives from these countries, or would have been executed if they'd stayed. So, yeah, they might be a little suspicious of the government, but still, people like that can become professional. And there again, I think the IFCN could play a role. If there was a sense that the IFCN was in some way supervising these groups, certifying them, it's tricky territory, but the IFCN has not been afraid to have an ethical code and to prescribe certain ethical procedures. They could create advisory boards. The IFCN, you have to reapply for your IFCN certification and so forth. The IFCN is not above expressing opinions on fact-checking groups' work. So that might be an approach. I think all of this would be much harder without the IFCN.
Thanks. Mario, I have one question to you. We're getting close to the end, but I wanted to ask you, based on your research and your survey of journalist skills, what do you think are crucial skills for journalists in order to be able to detect misinformation, manipulations in their work as journalists?
Yeah, overall, these skills and competences do not differ from skills and competencies journalists should use in everyday reporting anyway. But the context in which the information reaches the journalist, they need to, or maybe we need to help the journalist to reassess what sort of sets of skills to use in certain situations and how to recognize those situations. So it's a support of different sort. Yeah, we thought also that there are certain very specific skills, but no, actually it does not refer to that. It refers to using skills in adequate situation or choosing the situation in which to use them. So maybe it's in this field.
Okay. Do you have any final remarks, any concluding remarks you would like to end this session with?
I would just say that I've tried not to, as much as possible, not to name individual countries that I think would benefit, well, at least citizens would benefit from offshore fact-checking teams, because I think this is a reasonable area for the IFCN to get involved. And, some countries are obvious, some are less obvious, but to the extent possible, I think the IFCN or any other group that's interested in sponsoring this should try to weigh things not so much from a political good guys, bad guys perspective, but from a perspective of, is independent fact-checking possible to do in this country?
Thanks, Tom. And you, Mario?
Yeah, I would add that it's very good to have the knowledge from Tom's presentation that we've had this explosion of fact-checking organizations and it's moving towards networking, and it's really helpful for big countries but also small countries and small media environments, and we should all work for, as academics, for promoting networking within journalism, within and in between those fact-checking organizations. This is how we can tackle the information disorder in a wider sense, not just criticizing or analyzing or studying journalists as I did, but helping them to network and helping them to reassess many things. I think it's very important. And what Tom said in his presentations, I think there are many ideas to put into practice.
Thank you so much, both of you, and thank you so much for participating here. And hope to see you at Global Fact in Oslo next year. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you. Take care.